Okay, I think we're live.
Most. Yes, we're live. We're live.
Okay. So welcome everyone to the second day of our celebration on the centenary of the birth of revolutionary and freedom fighter Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. This is today we're gathered for our international keynote panel discussion. And I'll just give a short introduction before telling you about our panelists. The greatest tribute one can pay a revolutionary is to try and understand their ideas and further the revolutionary process in their legacy. This is what we're going to try and do today in this panel as we discuss the changing world order and its implications for the oppressed all over the world. Let me begin by introducing the Saturday Free School to those who have joined us for the first time. The Free School is a school for learning, but also represents a school of thought. We are based in the historic Church of the Advocate in North Philadelphia and are rooted in the thinking of the Black radical tradition and in figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, and Martin Luther King, as well as leaders of the revolutionary anti-colonial tradition such as Mahatma Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, Winnie Mandela, Fidel Castro, Amilcar Cabral, among others. We have organized several conferences and events to carry out the task of the political education of the people and believe that a re-education and a reinterpretation of revolutionary history is necessary to stride toward freedom today. Our past projects include the Year of Du Bois and also the Year of Gandhi. So I'd like to start the session today by framing the historical context of this discussion. I believe that we are in a time of crisis in the global political and economic order. This crisis can only be understood by tracing it back to the era of colonial domination. In South Asia, colonial rule was a time of the breakdown of Indian civilization, both economically as the British deindustrialized India and spiritually as they colonized the minds of our intellectuals, condemning us to forever believe in the backwardness of our own people. This was a period of great suffering for the masses of India as famine, illiteracy, and disease ravaged the country. From this emerged the great movement for freedom that we now call the Indian freedom struggle. The freedom struggle drew on the traditions of our people, even as it looked on with great attention at the radical new experiment in human society that was taking place in the Soviet Union. The freedom struggle led by Gandhi was able to articulate a united people's call for self-determination and liberation, even as the British created divisions and manipulated differences in the complex political landscape of India. Their policy of divide and rule came to a head on the eve of India's independence, when India was split brutally into two halves. Millions lost their lives and their homes in the savage partition of India. It would be wise for us to remember that partition has long been a tool of imperialist domination, and even Africa was divided up into small, unviable states, condemned to perpetual ethnic and economic war. The partition of India served British and later American interests well. Pakistan became an ally of the West in South Asia, even as Nehru embarked on a policy of non-alignment. But Pakistan was itself an unviable state. It was a nation split into two, largely Urdu and Punjabi speaking West Pakistan and Bengali East Pakistan. They were separated culturally and geographically. Pakistan was ruled from the West.
Well, what does it say?
And an unequal nation emerged, with the people of East Pakistan treated as colonial subjects, denied their cultural, political, and economic rights in their own land. What began as a movement for recognition of Bengali as an official language and against the imposition of Urdu eventually became a movement for economic, cultural, and political self-determination.
Continue.
Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, or Bangabandhu, as he was named by his people, emerged as its leader. Like all revolutionary leaders, he knew the pulse of the Bengali people. He listened intently to their voices and articulated their thoughts on the political stage. For this, they trusted him completely. On March 7, 1971, Mujibur Rahman called for nothing less than full independence, declaring that the Bengali people have learned how to die for a cause and you will not be able to bring them under the yoke of your suppression. On March 25th, 1971, the US-backed Pakistani military dictatorship perpetuated a horrific genocide against the Bengali people, murdering intellectuals, minorities, children, and other innocents. Mujibur Rahman was arrested, but not before he declared that the Bengali people would fight till the end for their independence. The United States government supported the Yahya regime and put Cold War motivations over human ones. They were condemned not only by the people of the world, but also by the people of conscience in their own country. They threatened the South Asian subcontinent with nuclear war, sending their aircraft carriers into the Bay of Bengal. Nixon viewed the people of South Asia as subhuman, suggesting that they needed another famine. The Bangladeshi people resisted murder, rape, arson, and other acts of untold horror. The peasants of Bengal turned into liberation fighters once again. With the aid of the Indian Army, the Mukti Bahini freed the country from colonial regime of West Pakistan on December 17, 1971. The liberation war in Bangladesh was a cry for self-determination of the Bengali people, and the freedom of Bangladesh was a great blow to imperialism's plans in South Asia. Under their leader, Bangabandhu, the Bengali people stood tall and proud, confident in their civilization and their ability to build a future for their children. Bangabandhu joined the non-aligned movement and kept his close relationship with Indira Gandhi in India. He strove to rebuild Bangladesh as an independent, progressive force in the world and to provide for his people who had so valiantly fought for freedom and sacrificed so much. He opposed the war in Vietnam. He understood that colonialism did not end with formal independence and saw the need to end Western economic, military, and political domination. On the world stage, the revolutionary forces were ascendant. The oppressed saw hope in these movements and believed that freedom was not only possible but inevitable. Vietnam valiantly fought and resoundingly defeated the French and then the Americans. The liberation movements in Africa were moments away from freedom. The Cubans under Fidel remained strong. The Palestinians had found a principled leader in Yasser Arafat. The movement in South Africa was gaining ground. India under Indira Gandhi had entered into a principled alliance with the Soviet Union, and Sheikh Mujib maintained a warm relationship with them. It is in this period that the counter-revolutionary forces all over the world unleashed a series of assassinations. It began perhaps within the US with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., but then internationally with the murder of Salvador Allende and the coup in Chile. Bangabandhu, along with his family, was brutally assassinated in his home in 1975. The late 1970s saw the destabilization of the secular government in Afghanistan after Zia-ul-Haq came into power in Pakistan. Indira Gandhi was killed by her trusted bodyguards in 1984. The dream of an economically and politically independent South Asia was shattered and remains incomplete. We could say that the anti-colonial struggle remains incomplete and Bangabandhu's vision is yet to be brought to reality. After these assassinations and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have entered into another period of retreat and the economic domination by the West, often mediated by international organizations like the IMF and World Bank. This brings us to today. We live in a time when the Western nations, in particular the United States, find themselves in deep political, economic, and spiritual crisis. 70% of Americans do not believe in the legitimacy of their own government and institutions. Unemployment, opioid addiction, and violence plague their societies. Meanwhile, China is rising on the world stage. The Belt and Road Initiative represents a new paradigm for trade, one not reliant on military bases and the threat of war. Asian nations like China, Korea, and Vietnam have dealt with the coronavirus pandemic much more efficiently than the Western nations. What are the implications of the new multipolar world order, which includes the China-Russia alliance? How should we view the prospect of de-dollarization and a new global trade currency, such as the petro-yuan or a basket of currencies? What possibilities does this open up as the West goes into imperial retreat? This is a time ripe with possibilities, and it becomes imperative that we study the revolutionary movements of the past and be able to reinterpret them for today. With this, I would like to welcome our panelists, Anthony Monteiro, Prabhat Patnaik, and Rehman Sobhan. We will hear from all three and then end with an open discussion, including with all those present on Zoom and those who are listening to us on the live stream. We'll begin the presentations with Dr. Monteiro. Dr. Monteiro is a longtime freedom fighter in the struggle for Black liberation. He was part of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USA and is a world-renowned Du Boisian scholar. Welcome, Dr. Monteiro. With that, I would like you to please begin your presentation.
Thank you very, very much, Nanditha. And thank you for that very brilliant introduction to what we're doing today. And I'd like to express my happiness in being on the panel with two outstanding scholars from South Asia. And I was very gratified to hear our discussion earlier of the action of the Philadelphia longshoremen in refusing to load cargo going to Pakistan during the war in Bangladesh. And the name Richard Askew was mentioned. I should tell you that my father worked in that industry and was an active member of the union, Local 1291 of the International Longshoremen's Association, which Richard Askew led. My father was a part of that boycott of shipments to Pakistan. And I should say I worked in that industry for about a year. And that boycott is one of the glorious moments in the history of the US labor movement. It is not known enough among the people of this country or within the labor movement itself. So it's a proud moment for myself, knowing Richard Askew as a friend of my family and the industry that my father worked in for close to 4 decades. But I'd like to thank again Jahan, Meghna, their colleagues in India, Nanditha and Raju, for their vision and intellectual and moral courage in bringing this 2-day conference into being. In essence, it expands the boundaries of political and intellectual discourse, especially in the United States, and especially at this time of profound, almost existential crisis. In bringing this about, you have made possible that our peoples, and especially the people of the United States, you have made possible their realization that we all live in a single garment of destiny. And thus, by expanding the vision and ideological conditions of struggle for peace and democracy, and ultimately socialism in the United States, Meghna, Jahan, Nanditha, and Raju, you have made a stellar political contribution, and we hope going forward that we will build upon it as we go out among our people to educate them, to mobilize them for struggles that perhaps we have never seen in our country. And this event and what you have done inspires in me a love for the Saturday Free School and our collective work, a love that I didn't know I was really capable of. So Thank you very, very much. My topic, and I will briefly do it, is Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, Bangladesh, and Lessons for Our Moment of Crisis. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman begins not as a revolutionary necessarily. He is a member of the Awami League, a relatively conservative Muslim organization. But it and he responds to the protest of the people of East Bengal. And thus, in the course of their protests, the Pakistani regime and military enter upon a brutal repression that ultimately reaches levels of genocide. It is at this point that Sheikh Mujibur decides, along with his colleagues and along with the people of what was then East Pakistan, to unite in a struggle for self-determination and ultimately independence. It is a revolutionary unity of patriotic forces. It is joined, and this is, I think, foundational. It is joined by the government of India and its leader, its Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi. In my mind, this is one of the great moments in the history of independent India. It signifies certain very, very important things. On the part of the East Pakistanis and the Awami League and Sheikh Mujibur, it is a rejection of what I consider illegal and brutal partition of India that is masterminded by the British, and thus is a way to consider to continue British domination and influence in South Asia. It is also a signification of the reconfiguration of the Indian subcontinent, and thus it carries with it profound civilizational meaning. A point that I would like to return to as I will discuss the nature of the state which Sheikh Mujibur and his colleagues attempted to build. After winning their independence and winning the first election in what became Bangladesh, the Awami League opened its doors to unity of all the revolutionary and progressive forces in Bangladesh. There had been precedents for this. For example, the Cuban revolutionaries, led by Fidel and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, once overthrowing the Batista regime, called for unity of all patriotic and revolutionary forces. That unity with the July 26 movement, the Communist Party, what was called the Old Communist Party by this time, and elements of the Socialist Party produce this new Communist Party, a Communist Party which was the spearhead of the revolutionary and patriotic forces of Cuba. A similar situation occurred in the People's Republic of the Congo in Africa, under the leadership of Marion Ngouabe. After seizing power, they call for the unity of all revolutionary forces and the establishment of what in effect was and is a state of the whole people. I'll return to that. In Vietnam, after driving out and defeating the American military, the Vietnamese have gone through a process of national unity and the reconfiguration of the Communist Party and other revolutionary forces in the nation. As you know, Western imperialism divided Vietnam between North and South, and as such, two political movements emerge. But then upon liberation, they are united, a process similar to what would happen in Bangladesh. But then this occurs again within the framework of this Indo-Bangladeshi alliance. But even wider, as Nanditha has mentioned, the Indo-Soviet alliance, which created positive conditions for both India and Bangladesh and for the reuniting of South Asia, and moving forward to the achievement, again, of what I've called the state of the whole people. Now, just a quick note. Let me just go on. This was seen as a threat by the Western imperialist powers, especially Britain and the US. But it created, again, conditions for peace and unity in South Asia. And when talking of South Asia, we must include Burma, which is today Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and that entire region. A task of unity which is still unfulfilled. Civilization. In many respects, the struggles for national independence are not just struggles for national independence or national self-determination against colonialism, but they carry a weight, the weight of the struggle for civilization. As is well known, the West and the British colonialists in particular not only sought to control its colonies politically and economically, but to undermine their ancient civilizations and the possibility of remaking the ancient civilizations into modern and revolutionary civilizations. This very idea, although only expressed in embryonic form, was always an undercurrent, especially in the independence movement in India. And we need only reference Tagore and Gandhi, who sought to go back to the ancient cultural and civilizational values of the people in order to mobilize them for the modern struggle against colonialism and for the creation of new and revolutionary societies. However, the struggle in Bangladesh was not to move forward unimpededly. The coup d'etat and the brutal assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his family shocked the world and must be seen as a great setback from which Bangladesh has not yet fully recovered. However, not many years after this occurs, the unthinkable happens: the destruction of the Soviet state. The only great power in modern history to have abandoned imperial aims and sided with the oppressed and colonized in Asia, Africa, and South America. But then something even more unthinkable happens. The realization that the unraveling and undermining of the Soviet state and the Soviet Union as a nation had occurred because, in essence, Western intelligence had penetrated the highest levels of the Soviet state and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But even more unthinkable is the fact that the man who emerged as the head of the Soviet state and of the Soviet Party himself objectively was an agent of Western intelligence, and who quickly went about dismantling and violating every treaty and agreement between the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries, North Korea, Cuba, and on, leading to the fact that for 30 years now, the world has struggled with the fact that the United States has imposed a new imperialism, a new empire upon humanity under the slogans of the idea that the United States is an indispensable nation and is the beacon light of freedom and democracy. And if you do not accept the rule of law, and I put quotes around law, of US imperialism, you will be attacked, your leadership will be murdered, etc. Your nation will be brought to heel. And this is the meaning of the wars in the Middle East over the last 20 years, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria and Libya. And we know the outcomes of those wars. Finally, what can we learn? Where are we now? As Nanditha mentioned, it is fair to assess this moment as a moment of transition from the unipolar US single superpower, US military empire to something different. Of course, the rise of China, the fact that the US people are exhausted with unending war, that half of the US people, as a result of this military spending, is either in poverty or near poverty, that the nation is beset with violence on a scale that very few nations have ever seen, and politically, the US is divided in ways that we have not seen since the American Civil War. This is forcing, among certain elements of the ruling elite, the idea that the only way to save American imperialism in this condition is by a tactical retreat, for example, from Afghanistan, and abandoning its most elaborate ambitions for nations like Iraq, Syria, and Libya. This is what we have called an imperial retreat. It is inevitable and necessary. But in the United States itself, the ruling elite is now attempting to rebrand itself as anti-white supremacist, pro-human rights, and in some respects, even pro-peace. The crisis in the United States is a crisis that we refer to as a crisis of legitimacy. As Lenin put it, the ruling class can't rule in the old way, and the masses will not be ruled in the old way. But our condition seems to, at this moment, look more like what Karl Marx commented when he spoke about the Civil War in France, a clash of deep severity, but one where neither side at this moment is capable of winning. And thus, we look at something in this country which appears to be the possibility of the destruction of society itself, or as Marx put it, the destruction of all classes. While the world moves forward, the United States is embroiled in what some have called a cold civil war, a standoff, politically and in class and ideological terms within the country. But again, the world moves forward. Asia appears to be the center of a new movement that is non-Western, that in a sense shifts the axis of human civilization from Europe to Asia. And as we like to say, from the age of Europe, the 500 years of the age of Europe, to now the age of humanity. As W.E.B. Du Bois described it, where the darker races will now decide the future of humanity. For us, this is good. But our task, however, is to fight to align the American people with what is coming into being, rather than to see its fate only within the framework of the American political, foreign policy, and ideological frameworks. I'd just like to end. What must we learn and what must we teach our people? When I say our people, I'm talking about the multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious people that constitute the people of the United States of America. One, we must advocate that the only way out of the American crisis is in the fight for peace and solidarity with world humanity. A war with either Russia or China would be disastrous for the American people. It appears, or more than appears, that the Biden administration, while branding itself during the election as an alternative to what they called the neo-fascism of Trump, in fact, is an administration of war. Its rhetoric towards Russia, and of course the Putin government has responded in defense of its territory and national sovereignty. Its rhetoric towards China and the movement of military forces in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits is troubling. But this is a war administration. We can't see it in any other way. And thus, the answer to their warmongering is the call for peace and solidarity with the people, and in particular, the people of Asia. And I'm reminded of Lenin's framing of Asia at the end of his life. Advanced Asia and backward Europe. And so it is. The biblical admonition, the last shall be first. And so Asia rises, and hopefully, the vision of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, of a pan-Asia, beginning with a reconnection and realignment of East Bengal, of East Pakistan and India. And so we have a lot to learn from Indira and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. But the struggle for peace, the possibility of a new form of state organization and state power. And thus, when the United States ideologues continue to point the finger at nations and civilizations that do not adhere to the English concept of the supremacy of the individual, but in its place argues for the supremacy of the masses of people, we must stand with this new form of state organization. I've called it the state of the whole people. Others refer to it as the civilization state. Perhaps in South Asia, we might speak of a multi-civilizational state. But at its core is the unity of the working masses, of the peasantry, of the workers, of the progressive intelligentsia. Secondly, I don't think I'm being overly optimistic to say that we have entered a period where we must look forward to renewed struggle for freedom and a reconfiguration of the lives of nations and continents to fulfill the dreams of the first generation of anti-colonial fighters. We can look forward to this in Africa, the continent that suffered the most through assassinations and coups d'etats and ethnic warfare. That Africa has the possibility to reclaim the revolutionary spirit that led to the independence of Ghana and Guinea and Congo and on and on. Three, especially for the American people, we must redefine politically the fight for peace as a fight against imperialism and the fight for unity and solidarity with the darker nations, by which we mean, in the main, the nations of Asia and Africa. Fourth, the fight against neo-colonialism. In this respect, we have to see the meaning of what Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum calls the Great Reset. More appropriately should be named the capitalist reset. From the standpoint of the global and international struggle and the fight for peace, this is an attempt to rebrand neoliberal globalization for the nations of Africa and Asia, especially the smaller nations and the economically weaker nations. This must be understood as nothing less than a call for a new neo-colonialism, a new economic enslavement to the institutions of the European and American financial systems, headed by the IMF, the World Bank, but more than that, the great financial institutions, great meaning large, financial institutions of the West and their multinational corporations. With respect to this, A new feature of the fight against neo-colonialism is the struggle with the high-tech corporations, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and on and on. The ongoing now with this new technology struggle to penetrate the political, cultural, intellectual lives of multiple nations in the world. This is a threat to nations like India, of course, Bangladesh, of course, Myanmar, of course, the nations of Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, the Congo, and on and on. What they cannot achieve by direct occupation, they seek to achieve by the occupation of the intellectual and cultural lives of the people. A part of this, of course, is the seduction and buying off of a section of the national intelligentsia, and thus impoverishing nations that need their intelligentsia, impoverishing them and turning those who have been produced by the people, whose educations and careers have been paid for by the people, turning them into agents of the West and enemies of their own people. Lastly, the ideological struggle.
This is complete.
Many people think, or there has arisen in these times the idea that ideas don't matter. That to return to the ideas and the great fighters for ideas, such as freedom, such as the state of the whole people, such as democracy, to return to these great figures of not that long ago is to return to a past that's no longer relevant. We are being told that one's sexuality, one's race, as he or she defines it, one's gender, as he or she defines it, is more important than the larger struggles for humanity. Even in the United States, Martin Luther King is no longer viewed as the great moral hero that he was. We have forgotten his words about the fierce urgency of now, and that we're all wrapped in a single garment of destiny.
Before you take on some of this,
I would say that we have now, and we must give heightened importance to the ideological struggle. It's our ability and opportunity to do what we're doing here today, to share with our colleagues and comrades from South Asia our ideas, our experiences, our viewpoint of where the world is going. That is important. So with that, I'd like to end. Thank you very much, Nanditha, and everyone else for giving me this time.
Thank you, Dr. Monteiro. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Patnaik. Professor Prabhat Patnaik is one of the foremost Indian economists and a theorist of imperialism. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and was former Vice Chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board. I'll give it over to Professor Patnaik.
Thank you very much, Nandita. Thank you very much for having me as a member of this panel, which has Dr. Monteiro and my very old friend, Rehman Sobhan. It's a pleasure for me to meet up with him again. Let me begin by paying my tribute to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman on this occasion. Sheikh Mujib was an outstanding leader and a fighter for the freedom of a people who, I believe, arguably constitute the people who have seen distress and exploitation in a way that very few others, I would say none others in the world anywhere, have really seen. You know, the British colonial empire in India began with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. In 1765, the East India Company actually got the right to collect revenue from Bengal from the Mughal emperor, 1765. And having obtained the revenue collecting rights, they were so ruthless in squeezing the Bengal peasants that in 1770, there was a famine in which 10 million people died, and the entire Bengal presidency at that time had a population of 30 million. So 1/3 of the people and 10 million died in a famine, which was caused entirely by the ruthlessness of colonial administration in extracting revenue from an utterly distressed peasantry. Now, that was at the beginning of colonialism. You come to the end of, or towards the end of colonialism, in 1943, there was another famine in Bengal, which was caused by the fact that war finance by the colonial government on behalf of the British government. It was given as a loan to the British government. British troops were in fact fighting on the Eastern Front in Burma and so on against the Japanese. And that was financed by printing money, which caused a massive inflation in prices, and 3 million people died in that Bengal famine, with which most of you would be familiar. Professor Amartya Sen has written about it in his book, Poverty and Famines. Now, the point is that so colonialism began in Bengal with an unprecedented massive famine. It ended in Bengal with another massive famine. Now, of course, even after decolonization, even after independence and partition in 1947, the people of Bangladesh continued to suffer because of the virtual occupation of Bangladesh by the Pakistan army. And as a result, another liberation war had to be fought, which Sheikh Mujib led. And of course, that finally led to the independence of Bangladesh. So you can imagine these people have really, the people of Bangladesh, predominantly the Bengal peasants, have suffered immense hardships. And of course, Sheikh Mujib was their leader who led them finally to independence. Now, of course, with independence, Sheikh Mujib himself did not survive for very long. But on the other hand, the importance of his ideas continue to be so overwhelming in Bangladesh that today it would be no exaggeration to say that of all the states that were carved out of the old British Indian Empire, Bangladesh remains the most secular. Whether you look at Burma, whether you look at India, whether you look at Pakistan, none of them really has at this moment the kind of secularism being defended by the state the way you have in Bangladesh. Relatively speaking, Bangladesh remains the most secular. But on the other hand, also it is true that Bangladesh, in common with much of the third world, has belied its promise of economic liberation as far as the people are concerned. It has done very well, much better than India or Pakistan and so on. In fact, Bangladesh now has a per capita income which is higher than India. And what is more, if you look at The World Hunger Index, for instance, Bangladesh has a position which is better than either Pakistan or India. But on the other hand, let us not just compare Bangladesh with the other countries of South Asia, which of course has its place. I mean, this comparison is not illegitimate. But on the other hand, relative to the promise of the liberation struggle, neither Bangladesh nor India have really reached the kind of promise which, or, that promise has been belied. The promise of the liberation struggle has been belied. What is more, and this is where I would really like to spend most of my time, what is more, even the kind of growth that Bangladesh has had is growth which, of course, has been based on substantial amount of exports, and these exports are really produced, for instance, garments, they're produced in conditions which are really reminiscent of the conditions that Karl Marx was talking about in mid-Victorian England. I mean, I have no direct experience of the conditions of the garment producers in Bangladesh, but I've seen in India that actually those conditions are horrendous. A person is allowed only 3 minutes to go to the toilet in an entire working day. And if you go for a greater length of time, either your salary is cut or you are sacked. So that is the kind of condition under which much of our workforce to this day lives, and to that Bangladesh, in my view, is no exception. So economic liberation continues to elude our countries, notwithstanding the fact that some progress has taken place. And what is more, I believe that the inequalities have actually become much worse during the period of neoliberalism. They have become much worse for a very obvious reason, namely that you now have a situation in which capital is now mobile across countries. You have capital moving into, or if you like, activities moving into countries like India, Vietnam, and so on. Processes are moving in to produce for the international market, and services, for instance, I mean, you call centers and so on. Services are moving in to India from the metropolitan centers. And this kind of a shift of activity is quite unprecedented, never happened in the history of capitalism. But on the other hand, you actually find that while this has happened, nonetheless, the enormous amount of unemployment and reserve army of labor, which had been created by colonialism, far from getting exhausted, continues to become further accentuated. The fact that the levels of unemployment, I know about India, the levels of unemployment, I'm not talking about the COVID-19 crisis, the levels of unemployment which you find today before the crisis in India are actually much greater than they have been at any time since independence, is really of great significance. Therefore, on the one hand, there has been a shift of activities, there has been an increase in GDP, there has been an increase in per capita income. On the other hand, hunger continues, inequalities have become worse, and what is more, the reserve army of labor has not got exhausted. On the contrary, it has actually become worse. Now, if that is the case, then your wages, your real wages do not increase, while labor productivity is increasing. This is true all over the world. And this is something which underlies both the rise in world inequality as well as the dead end which neoliberalism has reached. Because as you know, a shift from wages to surplus is a shift that actually is associated with a tendency towards overproduction, because there's not enough demand for goods, because there's not enough increase in the purchasing power in the hands of the ordinary working people. This is an argument now occurring all over the world, which, let's say, Baran and Sweezy had put forward as happening in America in the 1950s and early 60s. But the point is that that time, the state had been active. The state had intervened through fiscal deficit and so on, through taxing the capitalists in order to generate the kind of demand that would ensure that the system did not run into a serious crisis. But any such intervention by the state is something which is opposed today by globalized finance capital. If you find, for instance, that the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP rises too much, in that case, you find that finance flows out of the country. That globalization of finance, which is a hallmark of the neoliberal regime, implies an incapacitation of the state in intervening, in raising the level of activity through fiscal means. This is something which has happened all over the world, which is why in the United States, for instance, far from there being a fiscal stimulus all these years, after the collapse of the housing bubble in 2008, the only way that the economy was sought to be stimulated was by using the monetary policy, by bringing interest rates down to virtually zero, so the capitalists can make some investment because of which the economy might revive. The capitalists did not, and the advanced capitalist world continues to be facing a crisis with high levels of unemployment, which, by the way, get camouflaged because of the fact that a large segment of the workforce drops out of the workforce because of discouraged worker effect. If you adjust for the reduction in the participation rate in the US, for instance, which has arisen in this very period, then unemployment in the US would be at least 8% officially. So the entire advanced capitalist world is actually stuck in a crisis, and this crisis has now reached the shores of the third world countries like India and others. And therefore, I believe that neoliberalism has reached a kind of dead end, because in it, there are no ways of getting the world out to a new kind of a recovery. What is being tried here now, and I'd like to spend some time on it. What is being tried here now is the following. You would notice that during this COVID-19, during the last 1 year, there has been a very significant increase as far as the fiscal deficit is concerned in all the advanced capitalist countries. That if you take the United States, Trump himself had announced a $2 trillion package of relief and recovery, and the same is true of Germany, the same is true of elsewhere in Europe and so on. So governments have expanded their fiscal deficits during this period, and the IMF, which is the custodian of world's fiscal conservatism, has really allowed Western governments to do this. But on the other hand, precisely in this period, the IMF, notwithstanding what it says about third world countries, has imposed drastic fiscal austerity on the third world countries. Oxfam made a study. According to the Oxfam study, it studied the IMF's debt restructuring agreements with 86 third world countries. It studied 91 agreements with these 86 countries. Of them, in 78 agreements, fiscal austerity was made into a condition. So precisely during the time that advanced capitalist countries have been able to provide greater relief to even their working people by enlarging their fiscal deficit, third world countries have been prevented from doing so precisely because of globalized finance and the IMF, which acts on behalf of globalized finance. Now, I see this pattern continuing into the future. You would have seen that, that Joe Biden has announced recently a $1.9 trillion package. Now, if those of which $1 trillion constitutes transfer payments by the government towards all kinds of segments of the working people. So if that $1.9 trillion is spent, in that case, you would find that the US would be having the largest fiscal deficit relative to GDP since the Second World War. Now, therefore, the strategy as far as the advanced capitalist world is concerned is to revive, in some sense, the Keynesian policies of demand management, in which the state plays a role in enlarging employment and so on. But on the other hand, when it comes to the third world country, I mean, why did the Keynesian demand management run into a crisis? It ran into a crisis because inflation took place. And why did inflation take place? Because if you have a capitalist economy functioning at a high level of activity, then of course, sooner or later, it generates pressures. The reserve army of labor tends to get exhausted, and therefore there is pressure in the labor market for higher prices. Likewise, you have raw material prices rising, all of which happened towards the late 60s and early 70s. Now, these inflationary pressures can be kept in check if it is the case that the third world countries' incomes are compressed, because then they would not be demanding as much of the raw materials, as much of the primary commodities, as much of the various goods as, in fact, they would if they were growing rapidly. And therefore, I believe that now we are reaching a situation where the strategy of revival of capitalism would be that the advanced capitalist countries would use the state to inject demand to revive their economies. But on the other hand, there would be an income compression through fiscal austerity all over the third world to make sure that they don't revive, so that there are no inflationary pressures rising because of scarcity of raw materials and this and that. Now, therefore, a differentiated dual strategy of boom in one part of the world and, of course, an engineered recession in the other part of the world is, I believe, now going to be the strategy which capitalism might actually be putting forward. Now, this wouldn't be a problem as far as the third world bourgeoisie is concerned, because the third world bourgeoisie can very well be part of the first world boom. It can shift its capital to the first world, but the working people in the third world would be the worst sufferers of this, as indeed they have been terrible sufferers during the last 1 year of the pandemic. I believe the kind of situation which the pandemic has actually forced on them is now going to continue even after the end of the pandemic as a part of the capitalist strategy of revival. Now, this would therefore mean that we would be once more having a kind of economic hiatus between the North and the South. And this hiatus is going to be perpetuated because of the hegemony of finance and the hegemony of the IMF and other such institutions which are, which speak for finance. Now, it is in this context that I believe that it will become necessary for third world countries like India, Bangladesh, and others to de-link from this process of globalization. If globalization does not bring them even the kind of growth with inequality that it had brought them earlier, then of course the social base for delinking would be even greater. It wouldn't be only the working people who would be interested in delinking, the urban middle class, the middle class. In fact, the peasant agitation in India, which is a wonderful example of farmers standing up and opposing a set of measures which are really imposed upon them in conformity with neoliberal policies, in conformity with the entire idea of globalization. Therefore, you'd have a big resistance, possibility of a big resistance building up in many third world countries, including India, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, to this process of neoliberal globalization, and a desire for delinking from it in order to really have an alternative basis for growth, a basis that would really be based on local demand, for which again you have to have much greater levels of equality. You know, sorry, these days, much is said deriding the Nehruvian period. You know, much is said saying that, you know, all that was terrible, and only under neoliberalism that we have had a doubling of the growth rate. But quite apart from anything else, I'll give you one example. Piketty and Chancel, two French economists, made an estimate of the level of income inequality in India. And they made a calculation, the top 1% of the population, what percentage of the national income did it get? And they found that this percentage kept declining after independence right until 1982, when it was as low as 6%. And since then, it has started rising in the 1980s, and particularly in the neoliberal period. Many people in India consider the neoliberal policy to have been introduced in mid-80s. So it kept rising until now it is at a level which is higher than at any time in our history. These are based on income tax data. Income tax was introduced in India in 1922. At any time since 1922, the level of inequality has not been as high as it is today. Now, therefore, I believe that it is possible now for us to think in terms of an alternative strategy based on the development of the nation, based on greater equality among the people, based on an expansion of the home market, and of course, based on much greater cooperation within the South. For instance, I believe in any such new strategy we can think of, there has to be cooperation within South Asia. I, for one, would argue, and I'm sure many economists in India would agree with me, that India should actually have unilateral tariff reduction vis-a-vis goods from Bangladesh. In other words, we don't negotiate with them that we'll give you tariff reduction only if you give us, but we have unilateral tariff reduction vis-a-vis goods in Bangladesh. So that, you know, it's on the basis of much greater South cooperation within South, particularly in South Asia, and of course an alternative trajectory of development which we can put forward, that we can really chart a new kind of strategy of growth. In this strategy of growth, my last point, I believe that we should actually have certain minimal economic rights. In other words, the betterment of the people should not be a largesse on the part of the state. It's not the case that the state is very kind and so on, and therefore it is providing transfers to the people or giving employment. It must be the right of every person to have employment and so on. I made a calculation. You take 5 basic economic rights: the right to employment, failing which you get a full wage, the right to food, the right to quality publicly provided education, at least up to the what we call higher secondary level. That means at least up to the entry to the college and perhaps even beyond that. But I made the calculation assuming it's only up to the entry to the college. The right to free, publicly funded, quality healthcare on the basis, as in the National Health Service that you find in Britain and Scandinavian countries, or you had in the Soviet Union, and the rights to a living old age pension and disability benefit. Just 5 rights. These 5 rights would cost, if you institutionalize them as fundamental justiciable economic rights of every individual, then that would require, in addition to what is spent on many of these heads today, 10% of the GDP. The 10% of the GDP you can raise by only 2 taxes. I should say that in order to spend 10% of the GDP, you don't have to raise 10%, because in economics there's a theorem of the multiplier, where if you spend 7% of GDP, then GDP increases and you get some back as taxation, that becomes 10%. So 7% of GDP you'd be able to get through only two taxes, both imposed on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax, and the other is a 1/3 inheritance tax. Now, an inheritance tax is something which is legitimate by the very philosophy of capitalism. Capitalism says that the capitalists have some special quality. Let us grant them that. But the capitalist children don't have those special qualities. Therefore, why should they be allowed to inherit property which actually has been amassed by the capitalists? Just these two taxes would be enough to finance, as I said, the 5 basic economic rights. And I think in order to do that, we have to get out of the clutches of globalized finance and be linked from globalization through capital controls and so on, and put in place an alternative strategy of development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. So last of our panelists, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Rehman Sobhan. Professor Sobhan was an active participant in the liberation war of Bangladesh. He worked closely with Bangabandhu after Bangladesh was liberated and was a founding member of the Planning Commission of Bangladesh. Currently, he is chairman of the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka, which he also founded. With that, I would like to give it over to Professor Sobhan.
One question, Nandita.
Yes.
As far as I recollect, the program was scheduled to go up to 9 o'clock for 1.5 hours. So is 9 o'clock the cutoff point?
We are a little late, but I think we could go on for a bit after 9, if that's okay with you.
Well, it's okay with me, but I mean, you are you can accommodate the program going on longer?
Yes, I think so.
All right. Well, let's see if I can do it. If I do it within my 30 minutes or less, then we shall see how that works. Now, before I proceed, I would like to begin by expressing my appreciation to Mr. Monteiro for his ancestral connection to our liberation struggle, and the fact that his father may well have contributed to the interception of an arms shipment which might have gone on to massacre Bangladeshis. So I in fact, am happy to connect with you and to compliment you. And I don't know if the message can be passed on to your father at the same time in his heavenly abode if he is not still with us. Now, the two presentations before me have, of course, spent a considerable period of time, as they were expected to, in addressing the issue of the nature of the global system and how, in fact, it has really created new structures of domination and exploitation, which have, in fact, graduated beyond the inherited colonial experience. But since this is also a conference which is commemorating Bangabandhu and Bishwabandhu, I presume my presence here would be more appropriate for me to, in fact, concentrate on Bangabandhu, though I will at the conclusion attempt to link up my presentation on the role of Bangabandhu in the liberation of Bangladesh and the society which he created, and global developments, and to reflect very briefly on the transformation which has taken place in the global system from the time of Bangabandhu and the consequential impacts that that time had on his eventual fate. Now, the Bangladesh liberation struggle has many unique features, and which I would want to briefly bring to your attention. Some of it has been spoken about by previous speakers. To begin with, of course, most discussions of national liberation movements tend to address the problem of liberation from a extraterritorial colonial power. In our case also, there was an element of extraterritoriality because Pakistan and Bangladesh were separated by 3,000 miles of Indian territory. But we were part of an integrated state of Pakistan, which emerged as a byproduct of the bifurcation of the independence movement. And therefore, the Bangladesh case was unique in the sense that it was a liberation struggle against a form of internal colonialism, where an elite based essentially in West Pakistan, 3,000 miles away, played a dominating and exploitative role on the majority population of Bangladesh. And the nature of this exploitative relationship implied two factors. One, it implied that you needed to deny democratic processes because within a democratic process, the demographic majority of the Bangladeshis would in fact have effectively been able to realize the rights which they felt they had attained once we became independent from the British. And secondly, of course, it ensured the elevation of religion and communal forces as a smokescreen to divert attention for people for the struggle for their democratic rights and for the realization of the self-rule for which they had fought against the British. So you had two false flag operations carried out by the internal colonial power. One, the denial of democracy, and the other, the exploitative and mendacious use of religion as an instrument to divert attention. It wasn't that the people who were practicing or using religion were themselves particularly religious. They had remarkably secular appetites of the basest sort, and this was being used for purely instrumental reasons. However, the struggle which took place in Bangladesh was therefore a struggle for democracy. It was a struggle for re-establishing a secular tradition because we had a very significant minority population of Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians. And above all, it was an attempt to move away from an exploitative relationship put in place by an elite-based ruling class with extraterritorial connections. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman emerged as the leader of this movement by putting emphasis on the need for self-rule for the Bengali people. His emphasis was to create a high level of autonomy within the Pakistan state, which would in fact give us rights to use our own resources and to make our own policy decisions and to essentially liberate ourselves from the class domination of a ruling elite based in West Pakistan, because the West Pakistan ruling elite did not only dominate West Pakistan, it dominated the East Wing, and virtually all the business and commercial activities were dominated by this elite. So there was therefore a classical paradigm which would be familiar to countries like Algeria and Vietnam, where you would have a dominant exploitative elite bourgeoisie from the colonial country. Now, in order to bring this about, when a major mass movement overthrew a military dictatorship, which had been the main face of this exploitative relationship, and the succeeding military leader who took over had to make accommodations by promising elections to the people of Pakistan. Bangabandhu, in fact, put great emphasis on using this opportunity to create a unique mobilization of the entire mass of the Bengali people. Because the whole tradition of colonial rule, whether it is internal or external, is to, of course, create divisions within society and to then build up a minority elite, which will play a comprador role in relationship to the dominant classes. And Bangabandhu's political strategy was to reach out to the masses of the people, which would in fact go over the heads of the traditional middle classes who dominated the political spaces and traditions, and to in fact bypass the emergent elites and to reach out to the working masses, which were the majority of whom were the peasantry and emerging section of the working people. This was therefore a very unique campaign, and within which he had to also create a sense of Bengali identity, which again had been subordinated under the mask of elevation of your religious identity. So you were engaged in a process of identity building where the whole notion of a Bengali identity within Pakistan had to be recreated as a Bengali identity within an autonomous nation state. At the same time, when you were reaching out to the people, you had to, in fact, not just present them with the exclusively nationalist agenda, you had to give them a sense of participation in the mobilization he was asking of them. I, and along with a number of economists, this is before the emergence of Bangladesh, were therefore invited by him to in fact advise him on the preparation of his manifesto for the election campaign. And one of the instructions he gave us was that if we are to reach out to the masses and not the traditional middle class base, you have to create a policy agenda which will in fact be relevant to their concerns. And this must be built on socialistic principles, which would in fact seek to end not just exploitation from extraterritorial forces, but prospective exploitation from an emergent elite capitalist class within the country, if you become in fact autonomous. And you would address the needs of the peasantry by addressing issues of agrarian reform and cooperative forms of production and marketing. These were instructions he gave us, again, not because he was a hardcore Marxist, though in fact he had visited China in 1952 as part of a Peace Council mission and had come away deeply impressed by the versions of socialism he saw being implemented under the Maoist regime at that time. But he came to this position from a purely pragmatic perspective of a person who had lived and worked amongst the masses. And so this emerged out of his own revealed lived experience rather than any theoretical construct. This was a unique feature of this. And he was deeply conscious of the exploitative nature of the relations of production which prevailed in Bangladesh at that time. So this was the framework in which he fought this election campaign, and which he won with a massive majority, which would in fact have given him the right, because he had a majority in the full national parliament, to in fact frame the constitution which would give self-rule to the people of Bangladesh and would enable them to in fact build an exploitation-free society. But this was challenged by the Pakistani ruling class and the military. And in order to suppress this, they attempted to frustrate the democratic process. Now, this brings me to the next phase of what was really unique to what Bangabandhu actually achieved. I mean, what was really remarkable about his movement was that because he had reached out to the masses, when the Pakistan army decided to go for this denial process, he launched a process of non-cooperation, which I believe has not really been seen in contemporary post-war history. The Indian non-cooperation movement of Mahatma Gandhi, of course, is world famous and has been a model for many, including Martin Luther King and others. But I would like to argue that what Bangabandhu did went well beyond what Mahatma Gandhi did. Because within a matter of 5 days, the entire population, and when I say the entire population, I just don't talk about the working population, but I also talk about segments of the administration, actually joined his movement. And in fact, when a military governor came in to replace the one who was being withdrawn, even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court refused to come forward to swear him in. In fact, the outgoing military commander, who had in fact attempted to suppress the movement through curfew and mass firing, eventually submitted his resignation because he wrote in writing in his resignation letter that all power has now gone into the hands of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and that in fact attempts to suppress this by violence, by force, would have no meaningful political outcome. And so he did not wish to continue this, and he felt that a negotiated settlement was imperative. Now, the next important feature, and again, I'll be very brief on this, is that not only did you then get into a situation where you had total non-cooperation, but it was found that in a phase of non-cooperation, the whole state stopped functioning because suddenly there was no one to pay wages, because everything was closed down, banks couldn't operate, fertilizer couldn't be given to the farmers, kerosene oil couldn't be given to the cooking medium. All these things had completely broken down. And so he had to take over the entire administration of the state, of the province at that time. And so you had the unique feature of a leader, undoubtedly with a democratic mandate, but with no constitutional authority, ruling the majority population of Pakistan, which consisted of 70 million people. And he became the effective administration. My own exposure, at that time I was just a teacher of economics at Dhaka University, to administration was to be a part of this, you may say this insurgent government, but who was in fact actually giving advice and instructions about how a state would be run under the orders of Bangabandhu, who was not effectively a prime minister or president, but was a democratically elected leader. And this sense of emancipation, therefore, did not need a formal declaration, because virtually from the earliest days of March, Bangladesh had become an independent sovereign territory. And when the military cracked down on Bangladesh on the 25th of March and launched their genocide, they launched a genocide which was originally intended to intimidate the ruling party and kill them, to attack the minorities. But at the end, they found that the entire population was against them. So that is when a process of what began simply as massacre and mass murder became a genocide, because you could not distinguish between friend and foe. Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindus all became a target merely by virtue of being Bengalis. And that is what the concept of genocide is all about. But more significant to that is that having created a mass mobilization, he then brought about a spontaneous uprising. Not only did the Bengali elements of the military immediately mutiny and take up arms, but the entire population, in fact, joined the struggle. I remember going through the countryside at that time and coming across ordinary peasants who had never been exposed to gunfire for many generations, and who had no tradition of armed warfare, as was the case in the frontier and in the Punjab, but getting ready to fight in sharpening staves and bamboos, picking up pickaxes and getting ready to fight, and for a period, in fact, actually fighting off the armed forces of the Pakistanis until they were overwhelmed. It was at that stage that the liberation movement moved across the border after Bangabandhu's arrest and sought the help of India. I again was one of the first people to reach India on the 31st of March, and to reach out to the Indian regime to seek their help. And I was then after that sent abroad to to seek recognition for Bangladesh, and most important, to get economic aid to Pakistan stopped. The United States was the main aid donor of Pakistan, and it became their main patron and their main source of arms. And of course, our target essentially was to go not just to the United States, but to all the other countries, and to in fact seek their intervention to get this genocide stopped. But Pakistan had become the main patron of Pakistan. The US has become the main patron of Pakistan, because they were engaged in this new strategic move for, in fact, actually seeking a relationship with Maoist China. And Pakistan was the intermediating force for that particular relationship. So that was the main reason at that point that the US supported Pakistan. But the mass mobilization we launched globally went over the head of the Nixon administration, and we reached out to all the citizens of the United States, including Comrade Monteiro's father. And of course, also to the legislative arm of the US. I, in fact, had the privilege of addressing senators in the US who, in fact, actually passed legislation stopping aid to Pakistan unless genocide was stopped. So this was the history of the process. Now, let me round this up by saying that the independent Bangladesh, which came into being, therefore, was a Bangladesh which was built on blood and struggle. The whole infrastructure had been destroyed in the war. People had been brought close to starvation, and you really had to build the Planning Commission from the ashes. And of course, those of us who were invited to set up the Planning Commission and to give direction to policy were again instructed by Bangabandhu that the Bangladesh which I want to build should not be the Pakistan we have left behind, where once Pakistan gained independence, it then used its independence to recreate an elite class which would in fact live and renew the imperial exploitative relationship with the masses. And the Bangladesh which I fought for, and for which millions have given their life, and most of those who gave their life were working people, should in fact really be presented with a vision and agenda which was really built around socialist principles of an exploitation-free society. Now, I won't go into the details of that process and the contradictions which then that created, because eventually post-liberation movements, where many such radical promises are made, it is unusual to actually implement them in the same radical elements in many cases, then find it more convenient to join hands with an emerging exploitative elite and to create a more hierarchical society. What was unique for Bangabandhu was that he stood firm by his commitment, and that is what eventually cost him his life. His challenge to the United States agenda in South Asia at that time also was an important factor, because the US, by way of remembrance, in fact, withheld aid shipments at a time when enormous natural disasters were taking place, which was in fact one important factor precipitating a famine in Bangladesh at that time, and it contributed to the destabilization process of that regime and ultimately to the assassinations which ended his life. So we lived in a world at that time where the US was the dominant force in the global economy. In fact, a number which I was looking at in 1970 showed that the United States at that point accounted for 36% of global GDP and about 54% of outward foreign direct investment going into the world. So the whole exploitative international system, which Prabhat has in fact talked about and which was being challenged by many of us at that time. In fact, this was the big subject in the meeting in Malagasy of third world economists at that time, about challenging the nature of the international system and Samir Amin's whole conception of capitalism on a world scale, which he was in fact actually developing as an argument. Now, at that time, you had a world where the US was dominant, the international institutions were created in their image, and the financial system was really an extension of the US system. Now, let me end this by giving you my conception of what has changed in the world since then. Because I think all of you have been talking about the rise of Asia and so forth. Prabhat has made some mention of that. Monteiro has made some mention of that. But actually, the problem is of a much more fundamental nature, because there have been now, in the last 50 years, deep structural changes in the global economy. As a consequence of which, the United States is no longer the global dominant economy. It has, in fact, actually become a second-class global force in the global economy. Let me give you a number to, in fact, suggest this. This number indicates that if you are using purchasing parity measures, then, in fact, the GDP of China is, in fact, actually larger. It counts for, I think, roughly about 24 or 25% of the global GDP. The United States now counts for about 21%. But even in conventional measures, of course, the US share of GDP has gone down from 36 to 16 to 24%, and China is now already approaching 22%. And in fact, in the next 2 to 3 years, even in conventional measures, it will overtake the United States. More significantly now, the US share of outward foreign direct investment has come down to about 9.5%, and China has now come down to about 8.9%. But this doesn't take into account now the new varieties of capital transfers which are taking place by China, now particularly through the BRI initiatives, where vast resources are in fact being injected into the global system, but particularly into Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which in fact really significantly outdo US capital flows. In fact, US was the dominant accumulator of foreign exchange reserves in 1970, which accounted for about $15 billion. In 2019, its foreign exchange reserves had risen to $516 billion. But in the meantime, China's foreign exchange reserves were $3.2 trillion. And in fact, they were actually financing the emerging deficits which Prabhat Patnaik had been talking about. And they now hold $1.3 trillion worth of US Treasury bills. So that in fact, the whole sustainability of the US economy now in fact has become dependent not on the outflows of US capital, but on the inflows of Asian capital. And this I include China, the oil producing countries of the Middle East, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, but particularly China, who also now holds sovereign wealth funds in the range of about $1.5 trillion. So what has changed in the world system now is a change in the rebalancing of the whole nature of the world economic system, in which the dominant sources of capital are now certainly not in the United States and not even in the Western world, because if you add in the European Union, the main centers of capital have now actually gone into the third world countries. There's the emerging 7, which of course includes also Brazil, which also includes Russia, and which also includes South Africa. But if you simply then look at Asia alone, they have now become the centerpiece of global accumulations of capital. And this now has profound implications for how the world will function. For one, the IMF and the World Bank are now no longer the sort of hegemonic forces which could in fact compel third world countries to do what they want. In fact, Bangladesh, which once upon a time depended on about foreign aid inflows dominated by the US and the World Bank for about 10 to 12% of their GDP, now only depend on about 2% of the GDP on aid inflows. And in fact, much bigger inflows are now coming in through Chinese loans, and including now the new Chinese Asian Infrastructure Bank and also the BRIC Bank, which has actually emerged. So that their capacity to now dictate policy agendas to us has become much weaker. I mean, of course, since we have now got a policy agenda which is much more attuned to the neoliberal agendas which in fact had been bequeathed to us, our policymakers can autonomously take those positions without being externally manipulated. But in fact, when we had a major conflict with the World Bank, Bangladesh could in fact still had the authority to resist it. And when it came to building the bridge across the Podda River, which is one of the world's biggest bridges now, it rejected the World Bank conditionalities relating to that project, and in fact decided to finance it from their own resources, but in fact to get loans from Chinese and to get Chinese contractors to in fact actually implement the construction. So what I leave you with now is an emerging 21st century in which the balance of economic power has in fact relocated to Asia. In fact, I came across a study making projections of the global economy going up to 2050. And what was interesting was that between now and 2050, it was projected, if you compare the G7 countries, which include the US and the traditional dominant powers, and the E7 countries, which include the 7 emerging countries, I think this also includes Turkey, but particularly China and India. Then if you look at trends in global growth, 80% of global growth in the period up to 2050 is going to originate from the E7 countries, and only 80% from the advanced economies or the G7 countries. So this is going to be a very different world and a very different world order. It will not necessarily be a more just world because, as Prabhat has pointed out, in all these countries, including in China, considerable inequalities are accumulating. And of course, this will have to be the new challenge and the new agenda. But the historical inherited agenda from the days of colonialism, when the Western capitalist powers were in a position to use their control of global finance and global financial institutions, and including their own banking institutions, to in fact decide how capital would flow, will no longer hold valid. And one of the great favors which was done to us by the financial crisis of 2007-8 was to demonstrate the complete incompetence and mendacity of the Western financial institutions. And the fact now that some of the biggest banks in the world are no longer in Wall Street, but are in fact actually located in China. So these are the significant points, in that the Export-Import Bank of China and some of the other banks which are now mainly underwriting the BRI process are much bigger than any of the major banks, and their lending operations are much bigger than the major Wall Street banks which are there now. So these are conditions we have to take into account. What sort of world will emerge from this? This is another big discussion. I would look forward to sitting with Monteiro and Prabhat on some other occasion and to have a much more extended discussion on the implications of such a world. But it is a completely different world from which I began my participation in a liberation struggle. I saw its frustration, but then I saw new mutations and new changes in the world taking place. I'm now 86 years old. I don't expect to go on to see what will happen down the road, but I hope that a young man like Mr. Monteiro will in fact have the opportunity to see us through to 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sobhan. I would like to invite the other people on Zoom to present any comments or questions they would have for the panelists. But before that, I'd like to read 3 comments that we've gotten on our live stream. The first is from Ram Mohan Rai. He says, Anthony Monteiro has done a very pithy and precise analysis. Peace and progress in Asia will pave the way forward for peace and trust all over the world. India's national freedom struggle, which was part of the anti-international imperialist movement, later expanded this idea as well. You talked about creating a comprehensive united front by giving examples of Cuba and other countries. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman grew on this side. Had Indira Gandhi in India and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto adopted it in Pakistan, in those circumstances, the results would have been different. What you put America's role in today's context is also relevant. The future will be of Asia, Africa, and other exploited nations of the past. The second comment is from Yusuf Khalifani. He says, very much needed the 2-day educational conference. I have 2 questions for anyone of the panelists to speak about. 1, is it safe to conclude that capitalism has no mechanism to change course once it reaches crisis conditions? Second, would it be correct to say that imperialism uses sanctions as a modern day policy to cause famine in a particular country? Thanks to everyone for producing the conference. Maybe we can have a few more comments and then the panelists can respond if they would wish to.
Yes, may I start with a question?
Sure.
A number of the panel, all of the panelists have spoken about the significance of the rise of Asia financially, particularly the People's Republic of China, and they've also talked about the positive and negative effects of China in this Bangladesh liberation war. But my question is basically is to ask more about the significance of this rise, particularly for South Asia, as well as for the future of the dollar as a global reserve currency.
Would any of the panelists like to respond to this question as well as Yusuf Khalfani's questions?
Well, I'll make a brief response which would sort of tangentially touch on this. You see, I think what we have to keep in mind when we are talking about the rise of Asia is, and the issues of what is going to happen in the world system, is that a very unique situation is now prevailing in the world. I'm not a historian, but my memories going back to ancient history of the Romans is that historically the dominant global power had both economic and military dominance. Whether this was the Roman Empire, whether this was the British Empire, and up to recently, it was the American Empire. For the first time in history, there's an asymmetry between military dominance and economic dominance. And you can see that all the responses of the US are largely in the military field. Their capacity to wield economic power except in the application of sanctions for particular countries, is in fact very limited. Now, this has very dangerous implications because it has the potential for creating a very dysfunctional world order where the traditional dominant power will be more inclined to, in fact, use its military pride. And of course, this is not something which will last forever, as it has lost its economic dominance. I cannot imagine that it will retain its military dominance indefinitely. And certainly, since it is now also being caught up in the areas of technology, there too, in fact, its capacity to exercise influence will be limited. So how the world will react to this changing balance, whether it will be a peaceful transition or whether it will be a process which is interrupted by military adventures taking place here and there to frustrate the process, will depend on how enlightened the emerging dominant economic power, which is China, conducts itself. Secondly, the remark which was made about South Asia, I think it is very important that India, in fact, gets its act together. The problem with India has been that it has been a very weak leader of the South Asian group, even though it is 80% of the South Asian economy, of the South Asian GDP. And it has not succeeded in building the sort of links and value chains which China has forged in East and Southeast Asia, where for every single country in that region, including Taiwan and South Korea and Australia, the main export markets and the main import sources are in fact China. Whereas in India, it is only China is the biggest economic player in Bangladesh and in South Asia as the biggest source of exports. And in fact, the US is perhaps the biggest market for ready-made garments. So the historic role which India was expected to play did not come about. Secondly, for the new Asian age to emerge, it is absolutely essential for India and China to, in fact, actually come and recreate the vision of Pandit Nehru when he convened the Asian Conference in 1946 on the eve of independence, where he wanted the rise of an Asian community. But in fact, actually, within Asia, India and China seem to now be in a potentially confrontational relationship. And for reasons best known to its leadership, India is choosing to, in fact, actually become part of the US strategic agenda of, in fact, actually attempting to retain its dominant space in the Asian and Southeast Asian region. But again, that is an absurd agenda because how do you, in fact, actually build Pacific alliances when, in fact, every prospective member of the alliance's deepest and most sustained economic relationships are with China, and you are wanting to build an alliance against China? It's completely nonsensical proposition, both economically and strategically. So the sensible idea, I would think, and which would be of great importance both to the future of South Asia and to the future of Asia, and eventually to the creation of a bipolar world order, would be for India and China to, in fact, actually come together to rebuild as partners rather than adversaries a new world order together. Thank you.
Nanditha, would you be kind enough to repeat Yusuf's second question, please?
Yes. He asks, would it be correct to say that imperialism uses sanctions as a modern day policy to cause famine in a particular country?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would agree that, yes, he's right. I mean, sanctions are directed against the people of particular countries. I agree with Professor Sobhan very, very much in the way he lays out the challenges for Asia, and in particular, the two largest economies and two largest nations in Asia. But then if we look at the United States, and to Youssef's initial question, does capitalism have mechanisms to make change, by which I mean to find ways out of its crises? I would say less and less. And here I agree with Professor Patnaik, who talks about this rising debt, state debt, and the problem of inflation. And that's a real problem for the United States. We're on the edge, so to speak. But when it comes to the question of imperial retreat and the military of the United States, in large measure, this is the probably the great task, the great political task of the American people. What America becomes and how it actualizes its place in the world is not a settled issue. And I know the United States might look different from the outside. And of course, the US media has its own way of spinning events. But from the inside of the United States, it looks like an existential crisis. What we call, or what political scientists call, a crisis of legitimacy. Let me give you a number. In one poll from the Pew Foundation, and even from the Brookings Institute, well-respected institutions that study the American population, 83% of the American people say that government does not serve them. As is clear, even the last election, still half of the American people feel that the election was stolen. Other indicators indicate that, I mean, majorities of the American population do not see their government as serving them. Now, on the question of war and peace, not since the end of the war in Vietnam have polls shown that the American people are more pro-peace. Well, you could say pro-peace or exhausted by war. I mean, the objective outcome in a lot of ways is the same. Now, along with the crises of the economy, and the crisis of the economy is a crisis of inequality, where a very, very tiny part of the population controls almost all of the wealth, large parts of the income, and half of the American population, I want to underline, half, are either in poverty or near poverty. And that alone does not even begin to tell the whole story. Formerly industrialized towns that have been deindustrialized. The main thing that is going on in those places are drug addiction and suicides and overdoses by drugs. The American people are dissatisfied in a way that I don't think people outside the United States can even imagine. We are on the cusp of political events unseen in our country, perhaps in its history. So the fate of war and peace, in many ways, rests upon the shoulders of the American people. And that's why in the free school, peace, the fight for peace, disarmament, imperial retreat, all of these issues are at the top of our agenda. Many people will say, well, you guys are just talking into a vacuum. Nobody's listening to you. People are marching for Black Lives Matter. People are more concerned with sexual identities. I would beg to differ. That is what the media says. But in the deepest sense, in the deep structure, in the soul of America, the desire to end war, to end poverty, and to create a new democracy in this country is what is happening. So I would say you have to include the American people, not 100%, but growing numbers in the mix when we consider the fate of humanity and the struggle for peace and against war.
Can I just make a comment here?
Yes,
You see,
please.
I think this idea of Asian dominance or Asia becoming important, I think I don't believe in it, frankly. I mean, I take it with an enormous pinch of salt. Why? You see, if you look at historically, leadership of the capitalist world has always been exercised by a country that has current account balance of payments deficits vis-a-vis the other capitalist countries. That means it keeps its market open to the others to accommodate their ambitions. Now, this is what Britain did. But on the other hand, Britain didn't get into a problem, taking away resources from the third world. It was deindustrializing countries like India. Therefore, Britain, on the one hand, had its market open to Germany and its market open to the United States and so on, accommodating their ambitions, but didn't get into a problem because it was actually selling its goods to India and also taking away the resources through the drain. Now, you look at today, the United States doesn't have that kind of an access to a drain. Therefore, the US has an enormous current account deficit vis-a-vis the rest of the world. That's because till Trump began his protectionism, the US market was open to all the various countries, including China. Okay. Now, the point is that if you look at China, China is a surplus country. In India today, deindustrialization and the neoliberalism, if there is one country whose goods are deindustrializing the Indian small producers, it's China. It's not the West. As a result, this idea of an Asian emergence actually, I think, does not reckon with the fact that China is not even planning to play the same role today as either the US played after the war till now, or as Britain had played throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. I mean, if China opened its markets to other countries and accepted their goods, yes, then of course China would pull up a whole lot of Asian countries. That's not what is happening. China has huge current account surpluses vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis all kinds of countries, not just vis-a-vis the West. And as a result, it's very difficult for, for there to be the kind of block that Rehman was talking about between India and China.
We leave that to another day, Prabhat.
Okay.
Would any of the other participants on Zoom like to say anything? Maybe Mr. S.P. Shukla or Comrade Jaya?
It's becoming a bit late for us, by the way. It's now,
Okay.
I haven't had my dinner yet.
Oh, I see. Okay. Would it be okay if I took 2 more comments and then we end? Okay, it seems like
I can maybe make I can ask a question if nobody else wants to say. And I just wanted to we have talked about the economic crisis and the crisis of finance capital. I wanted to also ask the panelists on their opinion of the political crisis. And I wanted to say that I think the economic crisis is also a crisis of liberal democracy. And we had heard that liberal democracy was the end of history. But I think today it is becoming increasingly clear that it is no longer the end of history and that it is in a state of crisis as a system. And I wanted to ask the panelists to speak on the political nature of this crisis, the possibility of transcending the system of liberal democracy, and also whether is this not the time to investigate new theories of statehood, investigate the concept of a people's democracy, and finally whether Bangabandhu's vision of statehood, how it contributes to this discussion and question.
Okay, maybe the panelists can respond. We can end with that.
Well, that would take another 2 hours, actually, for a proper response. So as I said, I would leave that to another day. I mean, if you are talking about the crisis of democracy, my goodness, how much more we can say about that, and what would be the features of that. But that's, as I said, another day.
Yeah, I think, since we often talk in world terms, global terms, global systemic terms, I think what Raju was hitting on is the crisis of the West. And even the fact that in the past, the West has had the ability through colonialism and neocolonialism to export its domestic crises in other parts of the world. I think, but now, as kind of we've all said, and some of the comments have alluded to, the world has changed. Professor Sobhan makes this point, and those options are not as available. So how does the West, and of course, since I'm in the West, how does the West deal, and how does the United States, the chief imperialist nation, how does it deal with the crisis, using its language, the crisis of democracy, which in reality, I think we could be, to be honest and transparent about, is a crisis of rule. Can the ruling elite rule? And a number of scholars are looking at this, commentators are looking at it. And so Raju, I agree with him that a big part of what the future will look like will depend upon the capacity of the ruling class, especially of the United States, to come through this crisis. And maybe it won't make it. I'll just stop there.
Okay. I would like to thank all the panelists, especially Professor Sobhan and Professor Patnaik and Dr. Anthony Monteiro. And I apologize for the slight delay today and for keeping you from your dinner. But maybe we can continue this conversation at a later time. And thank you to everyone who joined us today to pay tribute to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And with that, we can end. Thank you.
Okay.